Hey class, so hopefully you got a chance to see the last slideshow video I put together for you on the labor market and the financial market, and you also got a chance to see the video I put together of you that goes over some of the actual numerical and graphical examples from that chapter. And I think we're going to stick with that type of format. I'm going to lecture from the slides in a broad sense of the topics that we're going to read about or that you'll be reading about in the textbook. And then I'll provide a supplementary video which goes over some of the, the more nuanced problems step by step, so you actually have a sense for how to solve those problems. So that'll help, those of you who want a conceptual understanding, you can concentrate on the video that goes over the slideshow. And, if you then want to get some coverage on how to solve some of the problems we're going to be encountering, you can just refer to the problem solving / examples videos that I'll be posting alongside these here. So this chapter is going to be on slightly switching gears and making a more focused effort to understanding the macroeconomy. So we're going to be talking a lot. Like macroeconomists when we're discussing this chapter. So here's an outline of the class. We don't really, I'm sorry, an outline of the chapter. We don't really need to go over that because that's in your textbook. And again, this textbook is interesting in a sense that every chapter starts off with a photograph that gives you a historical sense. We've all known that pictures are worth 1,000 words. So here, this is a picture of folks waiting for what we called relief checks back then while the Great Depression occurred. So the Great Depression, if you haven't read about that in your Development of Western Civ class, was a very, very large scale economic, socioeconomic as well, and also eventually global recession that hit during the latter part of the 1920s and early part of the 1930s. By some accounts, lasting until World War II. Okay, and the question that perplexed a lot of macroeconomists back then was, why did this happen? Wasn't the free market, as described by Adam Smith, supposed to be the perfect economic machine? And so this large depression actually brought about a lot of the policies that we see in the present time. A school of thought known as Keynesian economics, and this depression actually put a little bit of the onus on the government to provide policies to stabilize the economy. So before we can understand all of that, we need to get a sense for what the ins and outs of the macroeconomy are. So here's a broad framework for what any type of policymaker will look at. And so here you've got a set of goals. You've got a framework that you have that you look through in order to get a sense of what the world looks like. Okay, and these are essentially a set of models. And economists use models similar to how microbiologists used, microscopes, similar to how a doctor will use a stethoscope, similar to how a polygrapher will use a polygraph machine. These are simply tools. Now, the tools are only as good as the individuals that are utilizing those tools. So we can't just use a tool and follow it as if we were, listening to an oracle in ancient Greece. We do have to look and understand what the weaknesses are of this framework that we're using and where the framework works and where it doesn't work. So there's a huge need to understand how to use these frameworks to interpret what's going on in the real world. And once we have a sense of that, we can then look at implementing certain types of policies that will correct the course of the economy in order for us to be able to reach our economic goals here, which include the economy growing. We want low unemployment, and we want low and, more importantly, stable inflation. Okay, so You can see here, this is bold, so this is going to be a definition, a vocabulary word, and it's one of the most popular terms in an economist's lexicon. That is gross domestic product, also known by its acronym GDP, and that is defined as the value of the output of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. All right. So the emphasis here is on all final goods and services. Services by definition are typically final, but we're going to learn that not all goods are final goods. Some goods are actually intermediate goods that go into the production of final goods, and we're going to have to know how to differentiate between the two of them so that we get an accurate sense of what GDP actually is. All right. So we can go about calculating GDP with one of two ways, and if we do our work correctly, we should land at approximately the same value. And so one of those is the total dollar value of what consumers purchase in the economy. And then we have the total dollar value of what the country actually produces. And those two should track each other very, very closely. And if they don't, macroeconomists have also built in what I like to call a cheat code or a check valve, where those two values do end up being equal to each other in an accounting sense. Okay, so now let's focus on the first part, which is who purchases all of the things that the economy produces. So we're going to look at the components of demand now. All right, and demand is going to be broken down into 4 buckets. Okay, so we have consumer spending, which we also call consumption. We have business spending, which is referred to as investment. And then we have the government making purchases of those final goods and services from the economy. And finally, we have the foreigners who are making purchases of our goods and services that are produced here as well. So again, these are a list of the needs and wants of the economy. And this is a totally different perspective than what the economy actually produces. All right. So when we look at the pie chart of what that looks like, you can see here that the consumption expenditure by households makes up the vast majority of the demand that is put upon the economy. All right, here it's around 67.2%, or somewhere around 2/3 is like the expectation there. And we can see we have other slices of the demand pie here. And so investment, and that is again the purchases of all final goods and services by businesses, makes up almost 1/5 of what the demand placed on the economy is. Government expenditure is a little bit bigger than investment. So again, this includes things like anywhere from the government purchasing an aircraft carrier from a government contractor, all the way down to the crosswalk guard from your local primary school who's working for the public grade school. Their salary counts as government expenditure. It's spending on a service. You also include cops, firefighters, military personnel. All that is included in government expenditure. So this is a pretty big piece of the pie there. Finally, the smallest piece is net export expenditure. So this is the foreign component of demand. But as we'll shortly see, while the net export expenditure makes up a small piece of the pie, the actual exports and imports that go into this calculation are not not as small or not as insignificant. All right, so let's take a look at some data, and you can see here that this is in percentage of GDP terms. So of all the demands that is placed on the economy, we want to look at, all right, what proportion, how do those proportions look like over time? Or if we go back to that pie chart, how does that pie chart change over time? And as you can see here, it actually remains fairly stable. And we've had a couple of pretty large recessions throughout this time period here, but you can see that not much is occurring. Consumption, stays around 2/3 historically. Government expenditure somewhere around 1/5. and investment expenditure a little bit less than a fifth, right? But now if we turn to the picture here on the right, you can see that, again, net exports is this value here, exports, minus that value there, imports. So the gap between these two values hasn't really changed much, but you can see that it has grown as a percentage of GDP over time. Okay, and so that's just, the world is becoming a more globalized place. And here's a picture of what that might look like. So while imports minus exports as a percentage of GDP doesn't change much, you can see that the economy here is exhibiting clear empirical evidence of globalization or integration with the rest of the world's economies. All right, so speaking of the net export component, let's take a closer look at that because this might not be as clear. So here is, again, it's going to be the value of exports minus the dollar value of imports, right? And what is an export and what is an import? An export, again, is a good or a service that is produced domestically that is purchased by someone overseas. And an import is the mirror image of that. It's a good or a service that is produced overseas that is then imported and purchased by someone here domestically, in the United States, for example. The trade balance, also known as net exports, is the gap or the difference between exports and imports. So here's the mathematical definition of that. It just becomes X minus M. The trade surplus, that is when a country's exports are larger than its imports. We have exports minus imports. That gives us either a positive or negative value, okay? So if the trade surplus is negative, we're actually running a trade deficit, right? That is because in that case, the imports would be greater than the exports, and then this value, when we subtract it from this value, we would get a negative value. But if this value is positive, if the trade surplus is positive, it means that we're exporting overseas more than we're importing from overseas. All right? And the trade deficit is the mirror image of the trade surplus. This is simply imports minus exports. So just like the trade surplus, if the trade deficit is positive, it means that imports are greater than exports. And if the trade deficit is negative, it means that we're running a trade surplus because in that case, the exports would be greater than the imports. A lot to think about, and hopefully your head's not spinning too badly. But a couple of numerical examples will probably drive that point home. And usually after the third or fourth time you do something like this, it sticks with you. Okay, so a very famous identity, and this is, we think of this as aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply. This is essentially an equation or identity which outlines the economy's overall equilibrium, okay? And we have here C plus I plus G plus net exports. These are the four components of aggregate demand, or if you remember, these are the four buckets that we were just talking about. But at all times, aggregate demand has to be equal to aggregate supply. And what is aggregate supply here? It's GDP. It's the total, market value of all final goods and services produced by a country within a certain period of time, okay? And at all times, there's going to be an equality between those two preserved. Okay, so now let's switch to actually what is produced by the economy. So we just came from what is demanded. We want to look at, all right, what is produced now, okay? So we've got 5 other buckets here for that. And you can see here that's made up of durable goods, non-durable goods, services, structures, and a change in inventories. And this one's the interesting one here. All right, so durable goods are essentially what they sound like. These are long-lasting goods like cars, refrigerators, appliances, laptops, cell phones, things like that. That's different than non-durable goods, which are things that through their very nature do not last a very long time. They wear out fairly quickly. Food being the most extreme example, because once you eat it, it is no longer there anymore. All right, and then clothing and bedding, sheets, towels also belongs in this bucket here of non-durable goods. Okay, so the idea here, I think, and not to, make light of this, is I remember the difference between durable goods and non-durable goods is that if someone dropped a durable good on your head, it would hurt. If someone dropped a non-durable good on your head, it probably wouldn't hurt. Hopefully that helps in some sense to remember what the difference between durable goods and non-durable goods are. All right. Services, which makes up the vast majority of what our economy produces, these are intangible things. I want to call it like talented human effort that someone else is willing to pay for. So you can think of this as entertainment, healthcare, education. These are things that you can't really buy and put on a shelf, right? You can't fold it and put it in your drawer. You can't put it in your refrigerator. Services primarily are the result of human effort combined with equipment, for example. So if I wanted someone to dig a hole in my backyard, all right, that's a service that I want to hire someone for. We're not at the point where a robot can come and just do that yet. So we do need to hire a human being to exert effort. But that human most likely is going to use a shovel. I would probably not want them using their hands to dig a hole in the dirt, but they're welcome to, I suppose. But usually someone who does a service usually uses a piece of equipment to do so. If you go get your hair cut, that is a service that you're paying for. Typically, your barber or your stylist is going to use a comb, a scissor, a shaver, something to do their job, right? And that's a big, big basket of what the economy produces is services. All right, we also produce structures, construction, things like that, new construction. So buildings that can be used as residences, factories, office buildings, retail stores, or for any other purpose. Storage, for example, that's a big one. And then finally, we have the change in inventories, right? So these are, if a good has been produced but it has not been sold yet, it's actually an increase in inventories. And if there's goods that haven't been produced but inventories start to be sold down, that would be a negative change in inventories, all right? So here's a nice bullet point to ensure that we go over, and that's every market transaction must have both a buyer and a seller. So GDP must be the same whether measured by what is demanded or by what is produced. Okay, so that goes back to why that equation holds with equality. Because, for example, if you're a business that produced a good or a service that someone has not purchased yet, so I guess it would be just a good. You don't really produce a service and don't sell it yet, all right? But if someone's produced a good that is sitting on a shelf that hasn't been sold yet, and it doesn't get sold, what the accountants will say is, well, if you don't sell it and you're a business, you end up buying it from yourself, okay? And so that preserves that equality there. And like I said, that's kind of a cheat code that economists use, right? So for instance, you can think of LaSalle Bakery up the street. If they bake a donut that is not sold at the end of the day, they can toss it out. But ultimately, on the books, they take that as a loss, meaning that they bought it. Someone buys it. And it's not someone from outside, then it's got to be LaSalle. LaSalle buys it from themselves. Okay. Here's the pie and its slices of what production looks like. And like I said, 60.8% of all the things that the economy produces are categorized as services. We are a service-oriented economy, and you can see here that durable goods make up the second largest component, 16.7%. Non-durable goods make up the second largest component third largest component at 13.4%. And then we have structures or construction at 9.1%. Changes in inventories are somewhere here, but it's so small that it's statistically no different than 0% compared to the size of the economy, and that's something that we hope for. If changes in inventories was positive and it was big, it would mean that a lot of businesses are making things that are not being purchased by other people. All right, and that's what we do not want in the economy. Ultimately, we want people who work and create value. Either they're going to produce a product that someone else wants to pay for, they are willing to buy, or they're going to be able to provide labor that another company is going to want to purchase from them in order to produce a good or service that someone else is going to want to buy. But ultimately, the name of the game here is the production of value, right? And we would like to have this hold. Changes in inventories, we want that to be 0% or very, very close to zero. Now here, this picture is what the slices of the pie look like over time. And unlike the demand side, here you can see that the economy has gone through a sort of an evolutionary process where you can see here the two things that juxtapose themselves a lot is the difference between the trajectory of services and the trajectory of non-durable goods. Once upon a time, I guess we used to make a lot more clothes than what we do now. But for you to find some clothes that are produced in the United States here nowadays, you're going to spend a pretty penny because there's not many of those companies around. Why? Because we import most of our non-durable goods. If you go home and look at your bed sheets, chances are those bed sheets are made somewhere overseas. If you take a look at your designer shirt label, you look inside, chances are that shirt was not made here. It was made somewhere overseas. And that's something that's been going on since the 1950s. You can see that we've almost exchanged our non-durable goods sector for our services sector, right? Or in other words, lots of the people that maybe used to work in factories making shirts here now have moved on to services as we allow foreigners to do most of the work here, right? Structures, not surprisingly, has stayed around the same because as the economy grows, we need more structures produced to house people and workers. And that is something you can't really import or export, so it usually stays pretty constant. Durable goods, another one that stays fairly constant. You'd be surprised actually how large our manufacturing sector really is. It's actually very, very, very large compared to other economies in the world. So here, while everyone harps on us not manufacturing anything and importing everything, we actually do make a pretty good chunk of durable goods domestically here. All right, so here is something I brought up earlier as far as when the definition for GDP included the stipulation that we needed to concentrate only on final goods and services. And there's a reason for that. And that is to avoid this issue of double counting. Okay. So again, final goods and services, this is the output used directly for consumption, investment, government, and trade purposes, usually by the end user. All right. So these are goods that are at the furthest stage of production at the end of the year. The next stop for these goods is usually they're on the way home to a consumer or a household who's going to end up consuming them. All right. They're not going to be used in the production of something else. Okay. What's produced for the production of something else would be something called an intermediate good. This is output that is provided to other businesses at an intermediate stage of production, not for final users. This is not included in GDP calculation. So, for example, you can have somebody who owns a restaurant and they go to the grocery store and they purchase 2 separate gallons of milk. And one of those gallons of milk is going to be taken to the restaurant to make a milkshake with. And the other gallon of milk is going to be taken home for them to pour their kids a bowl of cereal. And it's the same exact gallon of milk, it's just the context is different. If this individual is going to take the milk to the restaurant to make a milkshake out of it, it counts as an intermediate good. Why? Because the milkshake that they're going to make is what the final good actually is. If the person takes that milk home in order to pour some cereal for their kids, that's a final good because it's ultimately being used by the end user. All right, it's in that final good situation, and we need to make sure we make that distinction because we'll end up double counting. And that is output that is counted more than once as it travels through the stages of production. And we need to make this, we need to pay particular attention so that we can avoid making this mistake of double counting, because it'll throw our GDP number off. It's going to make the economy look a little more productive than what it really is. A couple of more, perhaps more extraneous definitions. So gross national product is a little different than gross domestic product. So gross domestic product is concerned with the productivity that happens within a country's borders. Now, within a country's borders can be foreign companies making, products, goods, and services. All right. While that is counted towards GDP, it would not be counted towards GNP, or gross national product. Gross national product looks at the nationality of a worker or the nationality of a company. And so this includes what is produced domestically and what is produced by domestic labor and businesses abroad in a year. This excludes the production of foreign people and foreign companies within our border. All right, so that's an important distinction. Here's the key word here, national. Think of nationality. All right. So depreciation is the process by which capital ages over time and therefore loses its value. So what is capital? If you remember when I talked about the digging hole example, the shovel, or we were talking about the barber or the stylist using a pair of scissors. So any piece, any final good that is used by a company in the production of other final goods is considered a piece of capital. Even as much as even going so far as the building that the company is housed in is also a piece of capital. So it's like anything that can be used in the production of GDP is considered capital. All right. And by its very nature, while you use it, it does wear out. And that's what we call depreciation. And net national product, NNP, is gross national product minus depreciation. So this is getting at the very heart of the matter. And that is, you're going to peel all the layers of the onion away and go, all right, exactly what is this economy, or I should say, what is this economy's domestic companies? Not domestic, but I should say, well, yeah, let's say if we're talking about the United States, the question is, what's the total value of what U.S. residents and U.S. nationals and U.S. And companies owned by U.S. nationals is actually producing minus the wearing out of the equipment that they're using to make that production. All right, so that's like the most purest, accurate form of calculating what is being produced by a nation. But we usually focus just on GDP. These are definitions that you should know, but I guess the more common thing to do is to focus just on GDP. All right. Gross national income is focused on not necessarily what the nationals are producing, but it's more focused on the incomes that the nationals actually earn from production. So these are going to track each other very closely, GNI and GNP. But there are maybe some small, subtle differences. We don't need to get into that. But for our purposes here, we can assume that these are equal to each other. All right. Again, extraneous definitions which you may never use again, but you never know. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears. All right. And here we're going to have to go from nominal values, which are the values that you see out there in the economy, to real values, which is, well, let's hold the changes in prices of the same goods and services constant, and let's see how many more of these goods and services are being produced from one period of time to the next. right? So real value is what is going to really uncover the actual production of the economy, right? So let's go over these definitions. Nominal value is the economic statistic actually announced at that moment of time. It's not adjusted for the inflation rate. We'll talk about what inflation means. And the real value is it's an economic statistic that we have actually accounted for the changes in prices or inflation, right? And again, the real value is something that's more important for us because we're focused on productivity, right? And in order for us to understand how productivity is evolving, we need to look at what's being produced, all right? So here is nominal GDP, and you can see that there's been kind of a exponential increase, right? Had a bit of a recession here and another one over here. This is the Great Recession and this is COVID. And you can see that these provide a change in the trajectory, but over time, this kind of corrects itself and continues to grow. The units, again, anytime you see a graph like this, you really want to pay attention to what the units are. Now, this is in billions of dollars, all right? So 2,000 billion, this would actually be equal to $2 trillion. This is 4 trillion, 6 trillion, all the way up to 22 trillion, and we're far past that now. All right, in the year 2025, I don't know the statistic offhand, but it's somewhere between, I would have to guess, 24 to 26 trillion dollars. However, not only has production increased over time, but so has prices. Prices have also gone up. So this is something referred to as the GDP deflator. It is called a price index, which you want to think of that as a weighted average of prices, okay? Where the more weight is allocated to prices of goods and services that might be utilized or produced more in the economy than others. So think of it as just an average of the prices. And you can see here that since 1960, prices on average in the economy have grown almost in a linear fashion, right? And there's especially some growth happening here in the 1970s and early 1980s, which is a famous period of a high rate of inflation, okay? But here, you can see here that this, with indices, we usually normalize one of the time periods to equal 100 to make it easy to compare other periods against that one. So this is something called the base year. It's 2012, and in 2012, the value of the deflator was equal to 100. So if we were to go out to 2012, and we were to draw a line upwards, we would probably see that this value is pretty close to 100. All right, and that's to be expected. So what does that allow us to do? Well, let's say I want to compare, 2002 to 2012. So 2002 is somewhere around here. So that's going to be equal to, let's say, 80. All right. So how much did inflation go up between 2002 and 2012 over that 10-year time period? We would look at the difference between 100 and 80. All right. We would calculate that percentage change. So it would be, what is it? The latest data is 2012. So it would be 100 minus 80 divided by 100. All right. So it would be about an increase of 20%. All right. And that's why we like having this normalization occur, because it allows us to do those back of the hand calculations. Okay, so here, calculating real GDP, we can see that the way we can actually calculate it is we take nominal GDP, which is the statistics that we see out there, and we have to normalize by the price index. And what we get out of that is this calculation of real GDP, and that gives us a really good idea of what the economy is actually producing. Okay. All right. So here's an example from the textbook, and we've got the year 1960, 2005, and 2010. We're given the nominal GDP value, and again, this is in billions of dollars. So in 1960, nominal GDP was $543.3 billion. It was $13 trillion in 2005, and it was close to $15 trillion in 2010. All right. So here was the GDP deflator if now we're choosing 2005 to be the base year. And you can see here that these values differ. But the one thing for sure is in 2005, we always set that equal to 100. All right. Again, this is just an index which illustrates us the average price level in that period of time. All right. And so using that earlier formula, what is real GDP in 1960? Well, if you remember, it's going to be nominal GDP divided by the price level over 100, right? And when we do that, we actually get 2,859.5 billion, or almost $3 trillion. But this is in 2005 dollars, right? It's not in 1960s dollars, because again, the price level has gone up over time. And if prices increase over time, it means that it costs you more and more money to get the same real value, all right? So here you can see that in 2005 dollar terms, the amount of production is actually way bigger than 543.3, all right? Why? Because the value of money has gone down over time. All right. Now, what about nominal GDP versus real GDP in 2005? Now, this gets at a pretty interesting situation. Why? Because take a look at what ends up happening. We're going to have 13,095.4 divided by 100 over 100. Now, what happens to any value if you divide it by 1? You get the same value. So real GDP in 2005 dollars in the year 2005 is going to be equal to nominal GDP in 2005 dollars in the year 2005. Why? Because we're using the same unit of money, all right? The money has not eroded. It hasn't gained in value, okay? Because we're at the same period as the base year. And that's the case with all these calculations, is if you're in the base year, real GDP and nominal GDP are going to be equal to each other. All right. What about 2010? You can see here prices have gone up by 10% since 2005, and when we do that calculation, it's going to be 14,958.3 divided by 110 over 100, which is the same thing as 14,958.3 divided by 1.1. You're going to get this value here, 13,598.5. All right. This slide just shows you that we did perfect work. All right. See that? 13,095.4. It's the same thing. Why? Because look at the year 2005, and we're using 2005 prices. Okay. Now, real GDP and nominal GDP closely track each other. Typically, nominal GDP grows over time quicker than real GDP. Why? Because you don't have just real GDP happening. You also have prices increasing as well. And so eventually, no matter where you start, nominal GDP will cross over. Right? Now, the question is, where do we think this crosses over at? And that's an interesting hypothetical, right? So it looks like it crosses over here. And why does it cross over there? Well, the question is, what year is this? So this looks like it is in the year 2010 or so. So it must be the case that 2010 is, or somewhere around there, is the base year. And as we can see here, it says the black line measures U.S. GDP in real dollars, where all dollar values are converted to 2012 dollars. Okay. So I was a little bit off. So 2012 is the base year. So anytime you have a graph of real GDP and nominal GDP, wherever they intersect, that happens at the base year. Why? Because of what we just talked about earlier. And that is that in the base year, nominal GDP and real GDP are going to always be equal to each other. Okay, now let's take a look at calculating growth rates. Okay, so growth rates we want to do as we want to think of that as by what percent did a value change over time. Okay, and usually when we talk about economic statistics, we're looking at typically from one year to the next. Okay, so here we had our real GDP calculations, right? 2,859.5, 13,095.4, 13,598.5 billions of dollars. So here is what was the real GDP growth rate from 1960 to 2012. Okay, I think they meant to write 2010 because this isn't 2012 here, so that could be a small typo by your textbook author. Turn that into a 10. All right. We would take 2010 real GDP minus 1960 real GDP divided by 1960 real GDP. We would not multiply the bottom by 100. We would multiply the result by 100, and that gives us the percentage change. All right, so don't do that. That's another mistake. All right. So here, if we plug the values in from our graph up here, from our table, you can see that between 2010 and 1960, we went from 13,598.5. We're going to want to subtract 2,859.5 and then divide by 2,859.5. Okay. Now that should give us 3.76. And if we want to put that in percentage terms, you multiply that by 100, and that's where you get 376 from. Okay. So this, let's just write that down. So this is also going to be equal to 3.76. All right. Okay. So let's think of, we talked about the Great Depression. So when did those things happen, and, maybe why is a big, big question. All right. So here we look at sometimes when a government is reporting a growth rate of GDP, or they're reporting that quarter's growth, sometimes they'll multiply that value by 4 to turn it into a year. If they want to think of it like, we don't want to wait a year to get the actual value. So what do we take? Why don't we take this quarter's value, just multiply it by 4, and that gives us a sense for the year. All right, so that's one way of reporting GDP as an annualized rate, or as an annualized term. All right. If there is a significant decline in the output by the economy, or GDP, we call that a recession. And if this recession is especially prolonged and it's especially deep, meaning there's a big decline in national output or GDP, we actually call that a depression. Okay. So here's a graph, and you can see here that sometimes it roughly follows a trajectory, but once in a while you get this economy that goes up, comes down, and sometimes it comes down, goes back up, down, up, down, up, up, down, right? So while it follows a trajectory, it doesn't do so in a linear fashion, right? And that's where we get some of these, recessions. And here, earlier part, we were coming out of a depression, again, the Great Depression. Some economists thought that the financial crisis in 2008 actually should have been called a depression, just because of the sheer number of unemployment, how high unemployment went, but primarily for how long the recovery of that recession lasted. It took like a very, very, very long time for the economy to recover from the Great Recession. And so economists were worried about calling it a depression because they thought if we call it a depression, people are going to act like it's a depression, and it's going to take even longer to recover from this economic malady. All right, economics is a lot of psychology, okay? And so economists sometimes are afraid of self-fulfilling prophecies. If you call something a depression, people are going to act like it's a depression. No one's going to want to spend money. And voila, now you've got a depression because no one's spending money. So they specifically, I think, avoided calling it a depression for that reason. But the D word was definitely floating around at that time in specific circles. Okay, so if you've taken a biology class and you looked at populations, for example, you've got anytime you deal with a cycle of something, you've got peaks and troughs, and the economy is no different. So for the economy, a peak, this happens during the business cycle, right? And the business cycle is essentially the ins and outs of production, or the ins and outs of a recession and recovery that the economy naturally goes through, right? So during the business cycle, the highest point of output before a recession begins, we call that the peak of the business cycle. And the trough is the other way around. That's the opposite case. That's the lowest point of output in a recession before the economy starts to recover. Okay, so just that up, those ups and downs, you get the peak, and then followed by the trough, and then that completes an entire business cycle. Right. The recession actually lasts from peak to trough, and the economic upswing runs from the trough to the peak. So that might look something like this. Bear with me here because I'm about to make a mess. But in any case, let's say we have something that looks like this, and we go through a peak followed by a trough, and then we continue to grow. Okay, so this is the economy's the business cycle. So let's see here. This would be let's see. We can think of this as kind of be like one business cycle, more like starting here going down. All right, so this here is the peak of the business cycle, and this is the trough of the business cycle. Right? And what the definition here is saying is that actually the recession doesn't just start. It doesn't start at the bottom here and go up until we reach recovery there. The recession actually starts at the peak. That's the beginning of the recession, and this is the end of the recession. Right? So this period of time between the peak and the trough is the recession that's happening. Right? So somebody might say, well, you're at the trough and you call the recession off. People are going to scratch their heads going, well, the economy's still down. Why are you saying we're not in a recession anymore? But that's just the way the definition by the National Bureau of Economic Research has it. All right. Okay, now let's move on to looking at a little bit of an international flavor. So if we want to compare GDP from one country to the next, okay, that might pose a problem because different countries have different currencies, right? The European countries use the euro dollar, the United States uses the US dollar, Canada uses the Canadian dollar, and Mexico uses the peso. So how do we compare our economy to that of Europe, Canada, Mexico? Right? We need to use what's called the exchange rate, and that is the value or the price of one currency in terms of a different currency. So here's a pretty good example from your textbook. So let's compare Brazil's GDP in 2020 of 7.4 trillion real. Right? Now this doesn't look like a dollar. It definitely is not. And then we want to compare this to the US GDP of $20.9 trillion, and this is for the same year. All right. That's in 2020. The exchange rate was 2.362 real to $1. All right. And so the way you want to do this is you want to write this in a way where the units cancel. Okay. So we should follow this here, but let me show you what you can do. You can say, all right, let's see, hopefully I don't screw this up. So we're going to have this as, let's see, 20, let's put it as 20.9 trillion, and I'll put a dollar sign here. All right. And we've got 7.4 trillion. And let's put just an R for real. Okay. So how do we, the question would be, how do we create this calculation and write it so we can compare it to this one here? And so you're going to use the exchange rate. So the exchange rate is 2.362 reals equals to $1, right? So we're going to have to write that in a specific way so that the units actually cancel each other out. Right? Not an easy thing to do, but we're going to multiply this by a fraction, and the fraction has to make sense. Okay, so it's 2.362 reals to $1, so we're going to do that as dollar over 2.362 and let's put an R here for real. Okay, that's the exchange rate. And now what we can see is that we can cancel the real out. And it should always be the case that you cancel out the currency you don't want, and you're left with the currency that you do want. And so you can see here, it's going to be $7.4 trillion divided by 2.362, all right? And you should get the same value here, $3.1 trillion of GDP, okay? Obviously much less than 20.9 trillion, but then again, the United States is a very, very large country compared to Brazil. So, I mean, again, this is almost 7 times that GDP of Brazil. All right. So this is a very good example to go over. And again, practice with different values and come up with specific scenarios so you don't get caught off guard during an exam. All right. A better idea is to, if we do have a country that has a different population or different size than another one you want to compare, you want to use this statistic of GDP per capita. That helps you correct for the difference in the size of one economy compared to the other. So the US economy has the largest GDP in the world. It's also a populous country. So, but the question is its economy also larger on a person-to-person basis? Okay. And we're going to use this GDP per capita definition here, which is the GDP divided by the population, to actually understand what GDP per capita is going to be. So here, if we have 7.4 trillion real for Brazil, you're going to want to divide by the population of Brazil, and that gives you a per capita sense of what output is, or the average level of production by each person in the economy. Likewise, in the US, if it's $20.9 trillion or whatever that value was, you're going to divide that by 350 million, or whatever our population is, and that gives you a sense of what per capita GDP is in the United States. Now you make a kind of an apples to apples comparison, right? Okay, so the last slide is an interesting question, and that is, what is GDP trying to track? GDP is trying to track what people's overall standard of living is, right? And that's a definition of all elements that affect people's happiness and well-being, whether they are bought and sold in the market or they're not, okay? And there are some differences between GDP and a good standard of living, though. Or in other words, countries that have a high level of GDP per capita and also a high level of a standard of living. So GDP does not include leisure time, so time spent away from productive activities. It doesn't include environmental cleanliness, health, and learning. It does not include production that is not exchanged in the market. So for example, if a parent stays home to raise a child while the other parent goes and works, that effort put forth into raising a child is not calculated towards GDP, even though that might be a very, very, very important component of effort that impacts the economy, right? GDP does not include the level of inequality in a society, so how much income the top earners are making compared to the incomes of the bottom earners. What's the gap between the two of them? GDP does not include that. GDP is an average. We're taking the, again, total GDP and dividing by the population. That gives you an average amount of income each person earns. It does not tell you how the gaps between the top and the bottom look. All right. And GDP does not include technologies and products that are available as well. So it's important to consider, again, what the weaknesses and the strengths are. Now, if you were to, and I've done this experiment with some past students before as well, if you were to look at the GDP per capita of the world's economies, and you were to also compare it to, let's say, the rate of child mortality, or the rate of literacy, or the rate of, or the value of, or the level of human rights in specific countries, what you'll find is there's a really, really good correlation between the countries that have a high level of GDP per capita and are characterized by social qualities that we find attractive as a society. Things like a low infant mortality rate, things like access to food, for instance. All right, when you look at countries that have a very, very low level of GDP per capita, you would be actually gobsmacked by the actual terrible levels of living that some of the lesser well-off people in those societies endure. All right, so while GDP doesn't include all this, it does a pretty darn good job of characterizing the standard of living in a global sense. All right. Okay, that's all I had for this video, and I'll accompany this along with a example slideshow as well, or I'm sorry, an example video as well, to maybe go over some of the more subtle points in this chapter. All right, we'll see you next time.